Welcome to the legacy of the oppressed. The time has come to bring the change. The air in the Georgia Low Country was not merely an atmospheric condition. It was a physical weight, a humid, suffocating entity, thick enough to swallow a scream before it could ever reach the moss-draped branches of the ancient, indifferent oaks that stood like silent sentinels along the perimeter of the fields. For Sarah, the big house was never the architectural marvel that the masters, visiting guests praised over glasses of amber bourbon. It was a bleached, skeletal monument to generational theft, a whitewashed sepulchre that stood atop the highest rise of the land as a constant, looming reminder of everything that had been bled out of her people to pay for those grand, Doric columns and the imported silk drapes that fluttered in windows she was only allowed to clean, never to look through. Since the age of 6, her life had been measured not in years or milestones, but in the hardening of her skin and the sharpening of her senses. Her hands were a map of her exploitation, calloused by the razor-sharp dried bracts of the cotton bolls and stained by the iron-rich red Georgia clay that seemed to want to pull her body back into the earth from which she toiled. The overseer's shadow was a literal and metaphorical eclipse, a dark, jagged shape that would stretch across the furrows long before the man himself arrived, carrying with him the pungent, acidic scent of cheap tobacco and the rhythmic, terrifying jingle of iron keys, a sound that represented the locking of doors she was never meant to open and the shackling of a future she was never meant to have. Yet, beneath the tattered fabric of her shift and the bowed submissiveness of her head, Sarah was a secret vessel for the Middle Passage stories, a repository for the oral histories told in frantic, rhythmic whispers behind the smokehouse when the moon was thin and the hounds were quiet. These stories were her true mother tongue, ancestral echoes of a blue water world where her people were navigators of stars and masters of metal, not units of labor or chattel listed in a dusty ledger, alongside the price of broken-down mules and bushels of winter corn. She understood with a terrifyingly precocious clarity that her captors viewed her as a biological machine designed to convert sunlight, water, and cornmeal into sheer, unadulterated profit, but within the hidden, fortified theater of her own mind, she was a dormant volcano, slowly gathering the tectonic heat of 1,000 daily injustices until the pressure became a power of its own. Every lash of the whip that she witnessed, every sister sold into the dark maw of the New Orleans markets, and every hour of stolen labor added to the molten core of her resentment, turning her spirit into something harder than the iron the master used to bind her. This was the silent, invisible inception of a war that had no front lines and no bugles, where the first and most radical act of revenge was simply the refusal to let them occupy the internal geography of her soul, proving that, in the suffocating, soul-crushing grip of the Antebellum South, the simple act of maintaining a private, uncolonized imagination was the first and most essential victory of the revolution to come. She memorized the tilt of the master's head when he was lying, the precise tremor in the mistress's voice when she was afraid, and the exact timing of the gate's heavy iron groan, turning her childhood of forced observation into a masterclass in structural sabotage. She knew that to survive was to win the first battle, but to remember was to prepare for the final war. And so she etched every grievance into the walls of her memory, creating a ledger of her own that no fire could consume and no overseer could confiscate. As Sarah transitioned from the nimble-fingered labor of childhood into the grueling, sun-bleached endurance of young womanhood, the plantation transformed in her eyes from a sprawling prison into a complex, mechanical puzzle that could be solved and, eventually, dismantled. The second paragraph of her life was defined by the transition from mere survival to active, clandestine intelligence gathering, where the submissive mask she wore became so seamless that it functioned as a cloak of invisibility, allowing her to move through the big house and the stables like a ghost with a notebook for a mind. She realized that the master's power was not divine, as the Sunday sermons claimed, but was instead built upon a fragile foundation of paper, ink, and predictable habits. She began to study the flow of information as if it were the rising tide of the Savannah River, noting which letters brought the master to the brink of a rage-induced tremor and which ledgers remained locked in the mahogany desk. She learned to read the white man's weather, not the storms in the sky, but the storms in the counting house, understanding that when the price of cotton dipped in Liverpool, the lash would fall heavier in Georgia, and she used this knowledge to warn the others, turning her whispered insights into a communal shield. The smokehouse, the laundry, and the kitchen became the nodes of a sophisticated, invisible network where Sarah traded observations for secrets, learning the topography of the surrounding swamps from the runaways who had been caught and the weaknesses of the local patrols from the stable hands who cleaned the horses' hooves. She became a scholar of the master's fears, recognizing that the grander the house became, the more terrified its inhabitants were of the dark woods that pressed against the manicured lawns, and she fed that terror with subtle, untraceable acts of defiance that left the household rattled. She learned the chemistry of the kitchen, identifying which herbs could induce a temporary lethargy in the hounds, and which roots could be brewed into a tea that mirrored the symptoms of a contagious fever, providing her people with the only thing the plantation denied them, time. Her mind became a map of escape routes and hidden caches, a living compass that pointed always toward the North Star, even as her body remained anchored to the red clay of the fields. This was the period where her silent war moved from the defensive to the offensive, as she began to strategically lose the keys to the grain store, or, accidentally, spill water on the master's most urgent correspondence. Small fractures that she knew would eventually lead to a total structural failure of the system. She watched the way the white children were taught to command and the way they were taught to fear, realizing that the system of slavery was a poison that rotted the soul of the oppressor as surely as it bruised the body of the oppressed. And she resolved to be the one who survived the eventual collapse. Every night, she would lay on her thin pallet and mentally reconstruct the plantation's blueprints, identifying the exact points where a single spark, literal or metaphorical, could ignite the tinderbox of resentment that had been drying for decades. She was no longer just a laborer. She was an infiltrator in the house of her enemy, a shadow that had learned to move with the sun, waiting for the long, dark evening when the power would finally shift from those who held the whip to those who held the truth. By the time Sarah reached her 20th year, her transformation from an observer to a master of the invisible network was complete, and the third paragraph of her life became a study in the profound power of clandestine communication. in the world of the Georgia Low Country, where the law forbade the alphabet to the enslaved, Sarah and her kin developed a sophisticated, polyphonic language that existed in the frequencies the master's ears were not tuned to hear. This was not merely the hush harbor prayers of the deep woods, but a complex semiotic system where the tilt of a laundry line, the specific rhythm of a rhythmic work song, and the arrangement of stones near the creek bed served as a living newspaper for those who knew how to read the landscape. Sarah became the primary editor of this shadow press, her mind processing data from the kitchen, the stables, and the distant docks of Savannah to create a cohesive map of the shifting world beyond the plantation's perimeter. She learned to interpret the white man's silence, the way the master stopped talking when the newspaper mentioned the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, or the way the mistress gripped her tea saucer when rumors of a local uprising reached the parlor, and she translated these tremors into actionable intelligence for the quarters. This was the era of the internal underground, a period where Sarah organized the communal hoarding of resources, ensuring that every scrap of cured meat, every discarded bit of flint, and every ounce of medicinal root was cached in secret hollows known only to the shadows. She spent her nights sitting by the dying embers of the communal fire, not just for warmth, but to engage in the ancestral art of blood memory, where the stories of the Middle Passage were woven into the immediate strategies of survival, creating a bridge between the kings of the past and the revolutionaries of the future. She understood that the plantation relied on a manufactured sense of isolation, making the enslaved feel like they were on an island in a sea of enemies. So she worked tirelessly to break that illusion, sharing news of the growing abolitionist movements and the secret trails being blazed through the great dismal swamp. Her submissiveness remained her most effective armor. She played the role of the quiet one so perfectly that she was often present in rooms where the most sensitive political machinations were discussed, her presence dismissed as if she were a piece of furniture. While she polished the silver, she was actually polishing her understanding of the legal vulnerabilities of the master's estate. While she mended the master's coats, she was memorizing the contents of the letters found in his pockets, her mind a camera that captured every name, date, and destination. This was the period where the dormant volcano began to vent its first plumes of smoke, not in a visible eruption, but in the slow, agonizing erosion of the plantation's internal order. She sowed seeds of doubt among the overseers, used the grapevine telegraph to disrupt the efficiency of the harvest, and turned the master's own paranoia against him by feeding his suspicion of his white neighbors. Sarah proved that the most dangerous weapon in the Antebellum South was not a pistol or a torch, but a woman who had learned to weaponize her own invisibility, turning the very tools of her oppression into the instruments of a slow-motion coup that was being fought in the whispers of the smokehouse and the silent, searing glares across the cotton fields. The breaking point did not come with a single dramatic lash, but with the realization that the master intended to sell the youngest children of the quarters to cover his mounting gambling debts in Savannah, move that would shatter the fragile community Sarah had spent her life protecting. This moment transformed Sarah's silent war into a desperate, high-stakes gambit, where the alchemy of her long-held rage was finally distilled into a cold, lethal plan of action. She watched as the slave traders arrived, their polished carriages and smelling salts-scented clothes a grotesque contrast to the human misery. They were there to procure, and she knew that the time for observation had ended. Her internal volcano finally erupted, but it was not a chaotic flow of lava. It was a directed, surgical strike against the mechanical heart of the plantation's control. Sarah began the process of the great sabotage. Using the knowledge she had gathered about the overseer's keys, the hound's weaknesses, and the master's financial vulnerabilities to create a window of chaos that would allow the families to vanish into the swamp before the auction could begin. She worked with the ferocity of a woman who had nothing left to lose and the precision of an engineer, poisoning the hounds with the very herbs she had studied in the kitchen, and using the master's own stolen ledgers to forge the travel passes that would be their only hope of navigating the roads. The tension of this period was a physical cord stretched to the point of snapping. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a cannon blast, and every breath of the sleeping master felt like a personal affront to her existence. She realized in these hours that the big house was not a fortress, but a cage for its inhabitants as well. A place built on such profound fear that a single woman with a candle and a plan could bring the whole structure to its knees. She did not just want to escape. She wanted to leave the system paralyzed, ensuring that the pursuit would be hampered by a sudden epidemic among the horses and a mysterious fire in the record room that would consume the legal proof of their ownership. Her rage was no longer a burden. It was a fuel, a brilliantly white light that illuminated the path through the treachery of the Georgia night. As she gathered the shivering children and the resolute elders at the edge of the woods, she looked back at the big house and saw it for what it truly was, hollow shell, a monument to a lie that she had finally irrevocably exposed. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted, and as the first scent of smoke from the record room reached her nostrils, Sarah knew that the girl who had once been a unit of labor was now the commander of a ghost army, marching toward a horizon that the master's ledgers could never define. To the master, whose eyes were blinded by the arrogance of ownership, the slave quarters were merely a cluster of dilapidated, weather-beaten shacks designed for the temporary storage of exhausted units of labor, a place where the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, the smell of damp earth, and the heavy, dull ache of human fatigue. However, through Sarah's eyes, this cramped and muddy geography was transformed into a sophisticated war room, a clandestine headquarters where the hidden resistance was meticulously engineered. Sarah began to view the plantation not as a permanent reality, but as a mechanical system with inherent flaws, much like a clock with rusted gears that could be jammed with the right sliver of stone. She recognized that her perceived invisibility as a black woman was her most potent strategic asset, because the overseers viewed her as an unthinking extension of the field or the kitchen. She could stand in plain sight while her mind functioned as a surveyor's transit, measuring the distance between the cabin door and the tree line with the precision of an officer. She spent her evenings in the quarters, not in a state of defeated rest, but in a state of high-alert synthesis, gathering the fragments of information brought back by the other. Women the aunties who washed the master's linens, and the sisters who cooked his meals, piecing together a comprehensive map of the plantation's spiritual and physical vulnerabilities. She studied the grain of the wood in the barns to know which planks would groan under a heavy step and which would yield silently to a prying hand. She analyzed the soil composition of the riverbank, distinguishing the firm clay that could support a group in flight from the treacherous, sucking mud that would swallow a man whole. In this war room, every whispered conversation was a reconnaissance report, and every stolen glance was a data point. Sarah was the central intelligence officer of a ghost army, proving that the intellectual resistance of black women was a force of nature, a slow-moving tectonic plate that was quietly shifting the entire foundation of the South beneath the masters' oblivious feet. She observed with a predator's patience which gates creaked on their hinges due to the humidity's swollen wood, and she noted with surgical precision which guardsmen, like the younger overseer, Miller, whose eyes were always clouded by the haze of cheap rye, fell into a predictable, drunken stupor on Saturday nights when the big house was distracted by its own revelry. Sarah wasn't just a worker. She was a surveyor of the human spirit's decay, recognizing that the system of slavery required a level of constant vigilance that the white men were too lazy or too comfortable to maintain. She mapped the emotional terrain of the plantation, identifying which hounds could be silenced, not with violence, but with the psychological bribery of a pocketed scrap of salt pork or a low, melodic hum that mimicked the sounds of their own masters, effectively turning the plantation's first line of defense into her own silent allies. She recorded the timing of the night patrols as if they were the predictable orbits of distant, cold stars, realizing that the guards operated on a schedule of profound boredom that she could exploit with ease. She understood that their arrogance was their greatest weakness. They never checked the shadows twice, because they didn't believe the shadows were inhabited by minds sharper than their own. This section of her journey was a masterclass in behavioral mapping, where Sarah transformed the overseers from terrifying monsters into manageable variables in a complex equation of liberation, proving that the units of labor were actually the ones holding the stopwatch and the compass inside the big house, where the air was perfumed with lavender to mask the rot of the institution. Sarah's cartography reached its most dangerous and refined stage. She moved through the parlors and the hallways like a ghost in the machine, her eyes acting as a silent archive for every map, ledger, and letter left exposed by a master who assumed his property was illiterate. She memorized the layout of the internal rooms, the exact number of paces from the silver chest to the back pantry, the hidden latches on the windows, and the specific sound of the master's heavy, rhythmic breathing as he slept in the heat of the afternoon. This domestic front was where the intellectual resistance of black women was most potent, as they used their proximity to power to gather the intelligence that would eventually burn the system to the ground. Sarah watched the way the light hit the floorboards at different times of day, identifying the blind spots in the house where a person could stand in total darkness even while a candle was lit in the next room. She noted the arrival of the mail and the specific wax seals on the envelopes, learning to associate certain colors of ink with the shifting moods of the household and the broader political tremors of the 1850s. She became a scholar of the master's secrets, understanding that his power was a performance, a fragile theater of authority that relied on the silence of the people who polished his boots and served his wine. by mapping the interior life of the big house. Sarah was preparing a psychological breach, ensuring that when the time came to strike, she would not just be running from a building, but dismantling a hierarchy she had already deconstructed in her mind. Beyond the manicured lawns and the rows of cotton lay the third dimension of Sarah's map, the wild, untamed geography of the Georgia swamps, which the white world viewed as a nightmare, but Sarah viewed as a sanctuary. She spent years reading the woods from the edge of the fields, noting the way the moss grew thicker on the north side of the cypress trees and the specific flight patterns of the birds that signaled the presence of water or the approach of a stranger. She engaged in a communal mapping project with the elders, who shared ancestral knowledge of the low paths hidden underwater trails made of submerged logs and stones that allowed a person to cross a bayou without leaving a scent for the hounds. This was the cartography of the spirit, where the stars were not just distant lights, but a celestial navigation system that Sarah learned to read with the same fluency as a sea captain. She understood that the swamp was a mirror of the courtesan, place of perceived chaos that actually contained a rigorous internal order for those who knew the code. She mapped the edible plants, the medicinal roots that could stop a fever or a bleeding wound, and the hollow trees that could serve as temporary caches for food and flint. This knowledge turned the surrounding wilderness from a barrier into a highway, a vast green corridor that only the invisibles could navigate with confidence. To Sarah, the swamp was the final page of her ledger, the place where the master's maps ended and her own territory began, a space where the rules of the plantation were dissolved by the rising tide of the river and the impenetrable darkness of the canopy. The kitchen of the big house was a detached structure, a humid, soot-stained outpost that smelled of rendered lard, pungent rosemary, and the constant, biting tang of wood smoke. Yet, for Sarah, it was far more than a place of drudgery. It was her primary laboratory of power. In the hierarchy of the plantation, the cook was often seen as a harmless fixture, a woman whose world was bounded by the dimensions of the hearth and the rim of the copper pot. But Sarah utilized this dismissive perception as a veil for her sophisticated psychological and biological warfare. Unlike those who sought the immediate, violent gratification of arsenic, a path that was too quick, too easily traced by the local physician, and often resulted in the indiscriminate execution of the entire household staffs, Sarah practiced the refined, invisible art of slow attrition. She understood the alchemy of the human body, recognizing that the health of the master was a fragile thing, predicated on the very nourishment she provided with her own hands. She didn't just cook. She curated an environment of physical and mental fatigue for her oppressors, carefully balancing flavors to ensure the master remained sluggish, complacent, and dulled in his senses. The kitchen was the one place where the power dynamic was physically inverted, where the life of the master literally passed through the fingers of the woman he claimed to own. And Sarah treated this responsibility with the cold, analytical precision of a scientist. She studied the properties of every root and leaf, knowing which teas would induce a mild, untraceable lethargy that kept the overseers from their rounds, and which combinations of heavy fats would cloud the master's judgment during critical business negotiations. This was the genesis of her culinary resistance, a silent declaration that while the master might own the land, Sarah owned the life force that allowed him to walk upon it. The kitchen functioned as the plantation's most vital intelligence-gathering node, a place where the architecture of eavesdropping was perfected by Sarah and her network of domestic workers. Because the kitchen was detached but inextricably linked to the dining room by a narrow, shadowed walkway, it served as a perfect acoustic funnel, capturing the unfiltered conversations of the planters who believed their chattel were as deaf as the walls they scrubbed. Sarah mastered the art of presence-absence, moving through the dining room with a tray of biscuits or a pitcher of iced tea, while her mind functioned as a stenographer's pen, recording every detail of the master's discussions regarding the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, or the fluctuating prices of cotton in the Liverpool markets. She learned to interpret the tone of a man's voice before she even saw his face, distinguishing the sharp, frantic cadence of financial desperation from the arrogant, booming confidence of a successful harvest. In this massive, singular paragraph of her intellectual journey, we see Sarah transforming gossip into grand strategy. She understood that the news from the outside world was the most valuable ingredient she could provide to the quarters. While the master discussed the political tensions between the North and South as if they were abstract concepts, Sarah saw them as maps of opportunity, identifying which shifts in the law meant that the safe routes were changing. She created a linguistic code with the other house servants, a specific way of clinking a spoon against a saucer, or the placement of a napkin that signaled the urgency of a piece of overheard information. The dining room was the stage, but the kitchen was the director's chair, and Sarah sat within its smoke-filled sanctuary, filtering the master's secrets through the sieve of her own strategic brilliance, ensuring that the quarters were always 3 steps ahead of the next decree or the next sale, while the big house feasted on the slow attrition of Sarah's calculated menus. The slave quarters were the beneficiaries of her nutritional underground, a secret program of physical fortification that turned the scraps of the plantation into the fuel of a revolution. Sarah understood that a starving man cannot fight and a weak woman cannot run, so she utilized her position in the kitchen to divert the highest density nutrients to those who needed them most, engaging in a form of economic redistribution that was as radical as it was hidden. She learned the secrets of potlikker, the nutrient-rich water left over from boiling greens. She taught the mothers in the quarters how to use the medicinal weeds from the edge of the fields to supplement their meat rations of cornmeal and salt pork. She was a master of clandestine preservation, drying meats in the chimney's high flue where the overseers never looked, and catching jars of honey and lard in the false bottoms of flour barrels. This wasn't just about survival. It was about building a biological reservoir of strength that would be required for the eventual escape. Sarah saw the bodies of her kin as the true capital of the resistance, and she invested in them with every stolen calorie, ensuring that when the moment of the storm finally arrived, the people of the quarters would have the stamina to outrun the hounds and the clarity of mind to navigate the swamps. The kitchen was thus a double-edged sword, a place of subtle poisoning for the oppressor, and a place of secret strengthening for the oppressed. A culinary front line where Sarah fought for the very marrow of her people's bones in the deep hours of the night. When the big house was silent and the only light in the kitchen came from the pulsing orange glow of the dying embers, Sarah practiced the alchemy of the spirit, a form of psychological resistance that turned the act of cooking into a ritual of reclamation. She understood that the plantation sought to strip a person of their cultural identity, reducing them to a nameless cog in a cotton-producing machine, and she fought this erasure with the seasoning of memory. She smuggled okra and beni seeds into her cooking, flavors that acted as a sensory bridge to the world before the Middle Passage, reminding the elders of their dignity and the youth of their potential. In the kitchen, Sarah was not a servant. She was a priestess of the hearth, a keeper of the flame who used the transformative power of fire to turn the master's scraps feast. She led the whispered sessions around the kitchen table where the spirituals were, composed songs that contained the coded maps of the Underground Railroad, hidden in plain sight within the lyrics of Go Down Moses or Steal Away. This was the internal work of the resistance, the strengthening of the soul that had to precede the liberation of the body. Sarah's kitchen was a sanctuary where the dehumanization of the fields was washed away by the dignity of shared labor and the sanctity of the communal meal. She taught the younger girls that their hands, though stained by the work of the master, were capable of creating beauty and sustaining life, fostering a sense of agency that the lash could never quite destroy. The alchemy of the spirit was the ultimate ingredient that Sarah added to every meal, an invisible spice of hope that kept the storm brewing long after the master thought he had extinguished the last spark of rebellion. In the flickering amber light of the tallow candles within the quarters, Sarah and the elder women engaged in a labor that the overseers dismissed as mere woman's work. Yet this domestic chore was actually the manufacturing of a revolutionary manifesto. To the master, a quilt was a humble object of utility, a colorful patchwork of scraps designed to stave off the damp chill of the Georgia winter. To Sarah, it was a living parchment, a high-stakes cipher that bypassed the reach of the illiterate and the arrogant alike. Sarah realized that the very materials of their oppression, the discarded rags of the big house, the worn-out shifts of the field hands, and the coarse burlap of grain sacks, could be repurposed into a visual vocabulary of escape. She sat amongst the matriarchs, women like Aunt Hagar, whose hands were gnarled like the roots of the cypress trees, but possessed a surgical precision with a needle. And together they began the great stitching. This was the genesis of a tactile intelligence. While the master wrote his laws in ink that could be burned, Sarah wrote her maps in thread that was woven into the very fabric of their daily existence. They were not just making blankets. They were constructing a portable library of freedom, turning the porch of a slave cabin into a cartography studio, where the blueprint for a new nation was being drafted one square at a time. Sarah understood that the most effective secret is the one hidden in plain sight. And as she worked the needle through the heavy layers of cotton batting, she felt the weight of 10,000 ancestors guiding her hand, ensuring that the road to freedom was stitched so deeply into the fabric could ever erase the way home. She mastered the geometry of the underground, assigning lethal importance to the arrangement of colors and shapes that the white world viewed as merely decorative. A log cabin pattern, when displayed on a fence post or a porch railing, was not a sign of domesticity, but a critical intelligence report indicating that a safe house was nearby or that the resident was a friend of the friendless. Sarah experimented with the flying geese pattern, using the direction of the triangles to point toward the specific mountain passes or river crossings that were currently clear of patrols. She used the drunkard's path to warn travelers of the zigzagging routes necessary to evade the bloodhounds, turning a playful quilt name into a survival tactic. Sarah and the elders held quilting bees that were, in reality, high-level briefing sessions, where the women would read the progress of a quilt like a modern general reads a digital map, checking for updates on the shifting locations of the patrollers and the status of the northern bridges. The quilts became the paperless trail, a medium of communication that could be folded up and hidden under a bed or wrapped around a shivering child, carrying the secrets of the revolution into the very heart of the enemy's territory. Sarah's intellect was the thread that bound these symbols together, ensuring that the visual language was consistent enough to be understood by the initiated, but abstract enough to remain a complete mystery to the men who thought they owned the hands that made them. Beyond the navigational ciphers, the quilts served as a materiality of memory, a way for Sarah to record the history and the humanity of a people who were legally denied a written record. These scraps were the blood ink of the resistance, turning a quilt into a communal archive that grounded the tactical maps in a deep ancestral purpose. Sarah understood that the hidden resistance needed more than just directions. It needed a reason to keep walking when the legs failed and the heart grew cold. By stitching the history of their struggle into the fabric, she ensured that the quest for freedom was seen not as an individual flight, but as a generational mandate. She used specific dyes indigo for the depth of the night, madder root for the blood of the struggle, and walnut husks for the earth they walked upon, to create a sensory experience that reinforced the clandestine manual for liberation. Every stitch was a physical act of agency, a moment where Sarah reclaimed her time and her labor from the master and invested it in the future of her people. The quilts were a form of soft armor, providing physical warmth and psychological protection, acting as a reminder that their bodies were worthy of care and their minds were capable of complex, abstract thought. In the material world of the plantation, where they owned nothing, Sarah proved that they could still possess the narrative of their own lives, woven so tightly into the cotton that it became an inseparable part of their being. Sarah employed, utilizing the master's own stereotypes about docile and domestic black women to shield her activities, while she sat on the porch, seemingly lost in the rhythm of her work. She was actually coordinating the movements of the Underground Railroad, using the placement of quilts on the line as a silent signal to the runaways hiding in the nearby cornfields. She developed a color code of the laundry, where a red quilt might signal danger and a blue one indicated that the coast was clear. This was the ultimate subversion of the plantation's surveillance system. The overseers would walk past the porch, seeing only a group of women engaged in a peaceful hobby, never realizing they were walking through a command center. Sarah's porch became a node in a vast, invisible network that stretched from the Georgia Lowcountry to the Canadian border, a place where intelligence was gathered, processed, and broadcasted through the medium of textile. She taught the younger girls the language of the needle, ensuring that the resistance would continue even if she were taken, turning the domestic sphere into a training ground for future leaders. This was clandestine communication at its finest, proving that revolutionary acts do not always require a pulpit or a battlefield. Sometimes they only require a steady hand, a sharp needle, and the courage to write a manual for liberty in the very scraps of one's enslavement. The sound of the auctioneer's gavel was not merely a sharp percussion of wood on wood. It was a cosmic rupture, a sound that split the humid Georgia air and shattered the very foundations of the reality Sarah had spent decades meticulously navigating. In the harrowing economy of the 1850s domestic slave trade, a human being was reduced to a row of digits intended to balance a ledger of moral and financial bankruptcy. And on this day, those digits represented Sarah's only daughter, Maya the Master, a man whose soul had been eroded by the toxic combination of absolute power and a mounting, desperate gambling debt incurred in the velvet-lined parlors of Savannah, had decided that the most liquid asset on his estate was the future of a child. As the gavel fell, Sarah felt the vibration in the marrow of her bones, a cold, crystalline resonance that signaled the end of her silent storm and the beginning of a hurricane. The domestic slave trade was a machine designed to grind the heart of the black matriarch into the dust of profit. But the master had fundamentally miscalculated the physics of grief. He believed that stripping Sarah of her motherhood would render her a broken, docile shell, when, in fact, it stripped away the last remaining restraint on her tactical rage. The master had made the fatal mistake of assuming that a mother with nothing to lose could still be governed by the fear of the lash, failing to realize that by stealing her child's future, he had effectively ignited the fuse of his own inevitable destruction. This was not a period of weeping, or the performative sorrow that the mistress expected. It was a period of intense, hyper-focused calibration, where Sarah's mind functioned like a clockmaker's tool, removing the gears of empathy for her captors to make room for the machinery of retribution. She moved through the big house with a terrifyingly calm efficiency, her eyes no longer observing for the sake of survival, but for the sake of the most efficient arson. She looked at the whitewashed walls and saw not shelter, but tinder. She looked at the master's silver and saw the physical manifestation of her daughter's blood. She looked at the overseer and saw a ghost who simply hadn't realized he was dead yet. This section of her journey highlights the profound agentic shift of the enslaved woman, where the domestic sphere, the kitchen, the nursery, the parlors weaponized with a cold-blooded precision that only someone who has been treated as an object can truly master. Sarah utilized the invisibility she had cultivated over the years to plant the seeds of a psychological plague within the house, whispering the news of the coming storm to the other domestic workers, turning the master's own household staff into a silent, coordinated unit of sabotage. She stopped being a surveyor and became the earthquake itself, realizing that the only way to reclaim the pieces of her broken heart was to shatter the hands that had broken it. The master saw a servant who was unnervingly quiet, but he was too blinded, sense of superiority, to realize that the silence was the sound of a vacuum being created just before a massive explosion of justice. With the maps drawn, the ciphers stitched, and the alchemy of the kitchen mastered, Sarah entered the third phase, the architecture of the final reckoning. She used the log cabin signals from the quilts to communicate with the network of runaways already waiting in the swamps, and she used the slow attrition chemicals from the kitchen to ensure that the master and his guards were physically incapable of mounting an effective pursuit. This was the moment where the intellectual resistance of the black matriarch became a physical reality that overrode the laws of the state. Sarah was no longer navigating the system, she was overriding it. She facilitated the mass exodus of the quarters, ensuring that every family targeted by the master's next sale was already miles away, guided by the flying geese and the North Star. Before the first alarm could even be sounded, the war room of the quarters was now empty, its secrets carried away in the hearts of a people who were finally walking toward their own names. Sarah herself remained until the very end, a shadow in the halls of the big house, ensuring that the ledger, the book that had transformed her daughter into a debt, was the first thing to meet the flame of her candle. This was the ultimate act of reclaiming the narrative. By burning the records of ownership, she was erasing the legal fiction of her own submissiveness and restoring the reality of her sovereign soul. As the fires of the record room began to climb the drapes of the parlor, Sarah stood before the man who had held the gavel, not with a plea, but with the cold, absolute authority of a judge. She saw the terror in his eyes, the realization that the property was now the master of his fate hand. She understood that his power had always been an illusion, held together by her own cooperation, a cooperation that was now permanently revoked. This section analyzes the moral bankruptcy of the Antebellum South through the lens of this final encounter, showing how the institution of slavery relied on a psychological contract that Sarah had finally torn to pieces. The master had traded his humanity for a gambling debt, and in doing so, he had created the very monster that would now consume his legacy. Sarah spoke no words. Her presence was the indictment, her survival the verdict. She left him in the burning house not because she was cruel, but because he was already a relic of a world that no longer had a place for her or her daughter. The silent storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape where the old hierarchies were charred beyond recognition. And as Sarah stepped out onto the porch one last time, she saw the morning star rising over the trees, a light that belonged to no one but the people who were now following it toward the north. The night of the crimson moon was not a sudden impulse born of desperation, but the culmination of a decade spent studying the mechanical and social rhythms of the Georgia harvest period, when the master's arrogance reached its seasonal peak. During the big party, an annual display of grotesque opulence, where the planter elite gathered to toast their white gold under the flickering light of crystal chandeliers. The security of the plantation was at its most porous, weakened by the very wealth it sought to celebrate. Sarah understood that the harvest was the plantation's jugular vein. It was the moment when the entire year's stolen labor was concentrated in the ginning houses and the storage barns, vulnerable to a single, well-placed spark. They didn't view their movement as a flight of fear, but as a tactical withdrawal coupled with a scorched earth policy designed to leave the master with nothing but the debts he had used to buy their lives. Sarah utilized the invisibility of the kitchen staff and the laundry women to move supplies, tinder, flint, and jars of highly flammable rendered fat into position months in advance, hiding them within the very structures they intended to destroy. This was the architecture of the trap, where the celebration of the oppressors became the funeral dirge of their empire. And Sarah sat in the center of the web, her mind a stopwatch, counting down the seconds until the crimson moon rose over the cotton fields, signaling that the time for observation had ended and the time for retribution had arrived. As the sounds of the fiddles and the clinking of crystal drifted down from the big house, Sarah and her unit of saboteurs moved with the predatory grace of those who had mastered the shadows of their own prison. Sarah knew that burning the cotton was only half the battle. To truly cripple the estate, they had to destroy the means of production, ensuring that even if the fire were extinguished, the harvest could not be processed. Using heavy iron spikes, lost from the blacksmith's shop, and stones gathered from the riverbed, the women jammed the saws of the gins and snapped the drive belts, turning the state-of-the-art machinery into useless heaps of iron. This was industrial warfare, conducted by the very hands that had been forced to operate the machines. Sarah felt a grim satisfaction in the metallic crack of the equipment, a sound that she viewed as the first syllable of her own emancipation proclamation. They moved through the ginning house like ghosts, their communication limited to hand signals and the rhythmic, low-frequency humming that had been their secret language for years. By the time they reached the surplus cotton, thousands of pounds of white gold stacked in the dry, drafty barns, the mechanical infrastructure of the plantation was already a total loss. The sabotage was an act of profound intellectual agency, a statement that the people who were treated as tools were, in fact, the only ones who truly understood how the tools work, and more importantly, how to break them beyond repair. Cotton is a fickle and volatile fuel, and Sarah used her knowledge of heat and airflow to ensure that once the fire was set, it would be impossible to contain with the primitive buckets and manual pumps available to the overseers. She watched as the first spark caught the dry, fluffy fibers, a tiny orange eye that quickly grew into a roaring, sentient beast of crimson and gold. The fire served a dual purpose. It was a tactical distraction that drew the attention of every white man on the plantation toward the barns. And it was a spiritual signature, a physical manifestation of the rage that had been suppressed for generations. As the white gold evaporated into the night sky in a towering column of black smoke and orange sparks, Sarah felt the weight of her stolen labor being released into the atmosphere, a literal debt being cancelled by the flames. This was not a mindless act of arson. It was a calculated redistribution of energy, turning the fruit of their suffering into the light that would guide their escape. The crimson moon above seemed to reflect the fire below, creating a world of blood and light where the old rules of the Georgia Low Country no longer applied. Sarah stood at the edge of the inferno, the heat searing her skin but warming her soul, realizing that for the first time in her life, she was the one dictating the value of her own work hand. She had valued it at zero for the master and everything for herself. From the porch of the big house, the master and his guests looked out over a landscape that had been transformed from a source of profit into a graveyard of ambition. The white gold was gone, but more importantly, the illusion of control had been incinerated. They realized, too late, that the people they had viewed as docile were actually the architects of their ruin. Sarah watched from the shadows of the tree line as the master fell to his knees, his fine clothes stained with the soot of his own greed, and she felt no pity, only the cold, clear clarity of a debt. This was the signature of the shadow, a message left in the ruins that informed the entire county that the silent storm had finally broken, and that the terms of the engagement had changed forever. The economic sabotage had a ripple effect, destabilizing the master's credit with the banks in Savannah and ensuring that he would never have the resources to hunt them with the intensity he otherwise might have. Sarah had turned his wealth into a liability, a burning beacon that announced his failure to every neighbor and rival for miles around. The fire was the final period at the end of a long, brutal sentence. And as Sarah turned her back on the glowing embers, she knew that the man who had once owned her daughter's future was now a beggar in his own yard. A man whose only remaining possession was a pile of cooling ash and a memory of a power that he would never hold again. The transition from the scorched perimeter of the plantation into the emerald gloom of the great, dismal swamp was not merely a change in geography. It was a passage through a metaphysical veil into a realm where the laws of the master held no jurisdiction. As Sarah led her group across the threshold where the red Georgia clay gave way to the ancient, tea-colored waters of the basin, the air shifted from the scorched scent of burning cotton to the heavy, primal musk of peat, sulfur, and decaying vegetation. To the white men on horseback who loomed at the edge of the tree line, the swamp was a chaotic nightmare, a great dismal expanse of impenetrable thickets, venomous serpents, and miasmatic vapors that breathed fever into the lungs of the unwary. However, through Sarah's eyes, this labyrinth was a cathedral of liberation, a Blackwater kingdom whose complex topography she had been mapping in her mind for half a lifetime. She understood that the very features that terrified their pursuers, the interlocking cypress knees that tripped the uninitiated, the deceptive, quaking earth that could swallow a horse, and the labyrinthine network of stagnant sloughs were, in fact, the defensive battlements of a natural fortress. Sarah stood at the lead, her feet sinking into the cool, dark muck, feeling a profound sense of homecoming in the wildness. She was no longer a fugitive, but the sovereign architect of an exodus, leading her people into a landscape that demanded a different kind, literacy of fluency in the language of the land. Master's ledgers could never record. The physical grit of black women mothers like Sarah, who moved with a sleeping child strapped to her chest and a sack of precious grain balanced on her head, her muscles burning with a fire that was hotter than the sun she had toiled under for decades. They navigated through chest-deep waters, where the surface was a mirror of duckweed and the bottom was a treacherous tangle of roots, moving with a synchronized grace that prevented the splashing that would alert the professional slave catchers. Sarah observed her sister's women, who had been prime hands in the fields, transforming that stolen strength into the fuel for their own salvation. They hauled elderly grandparents through the thickets and formed human chains to cross the rushing creeks, their hands, once calloused by cotton, now serving as the anchors of a collective survival. In the swamp, there were no weak or strong categories. There was only the vanguard, a group of women who realized that their physical endurance was the primary barrier between their children and the auction block. Sarah led this line with a relentless, rhythmic pace, her eyes scanning for the specific mosses and barks she had studied in her kitchen laboratory, ensuring that even in the heart of the wilderness, her people were fed, healed, and moving toward the hidden hearths of the maroon communities. As they pushed deeper into the treacherous depths, a profound psychological shift occurred. The power dynamic of the South was completely inverted, turning the professional slave catchers into the prey and Sarah into the queen of the wilderness, the hunters. Men like the notorious tracker Silas, who relied on the brute force of his hounds and the technological advantage of his rifles, found themselves lost in the dark, blinded by a landscape that refused to submit to their maps or their wills. Sarah utilized her ancient knowledge of the land to set a trail of decoys, using the pungent scent of wild onions to confuse the hounds, and leading the pursuers toward the sucking sands that she knew to avoid. She understood that the pursuers were motivated by greed, while her group was motivated by the ancestral fire of liberty, a difference in conviction that made her people invisible while the hunters remained loud, clumsy, and vulnerable. Sarah would pause in the silence of the cypress groves, listening to the distant, frantic shouts of the men as they struggled with the terrain, and she felt a grim, restorative justice in their terror. They were finally experiencing the disorientation and the helplessness they had inflicted on others for centuries. In the labyrinth of the swamp, the master's world was a distant, fading dream, and the reality was a primal struggle where Sarah's intellect and grit were the apex predators, proving that when the law is removed, the truly powerful are those who know how to survive in the dark. Deep within the heart of the swamp lay the legendary maroon communities, the hidden cities of those who had never been broken. These communities were the living proof that a world without masters was not only possible, but had been thriving in the shadows for generations. As Sarah and her group were welcomed into the camouflaged encampments, they found a society built on the principles of mutual aid, ancestral spiritualism, and a rigorous defense of their sovereignty. This section delves into the cultural and logistical complexity of the maroon world, where Sarah found a war room that dwarfed her own in the quarters, a place where the intelligence of thousands of runaways was synthesized into a grand strategy for the total liberation of the South. She walked through the communal gardens where the white gold was replaced by the green gold of medicinal herbs and sustenance crops, and she spoke with the elders who had been the original architects of the hidden resistance. Sarah realized that she was not just a refugee, she was a contributor to a vast, living archive of Black agency that had existed in the interstices of the plantation system for centuries. In the swamp, Sarah was no longer Sarah the cook or Sarah the surveyor. She was Sarah the liberator, a woman whose name would be whispered in the quarters of a dozen plantations as a beacon of what was possible when a soul refuses to be fenced in. As the group emerged from the swamp's protective canopy, the open terrain of the Upper South presented a new, more clinical form of terror, the constant, agonizing necessity of total invisibility in a landscape designed to expose them. For Sarah, the North Star was no longer a poetic symbol of hope. It was a cold, indifferent navigational anchor, an absolute celestial guide that demanded absolute precision and a brutal discipline of the senses. Moving by night meant navigating a world where every snapping twig sounded like a pistol shot and every rustle of dry corn husks felt like a betrayal. Guided by the conducting methods pioneered by Moses herself, Harriet Tubman, whose legend had permeated the quarters like a holy ghost, Sarah transformed the group into a singular, silent organism. This section of the journey highlights the psychological price of the North Star. the silencing of the human instinct to cry out, to cough, or to breathe deeply in the face of exhaustion. Sarah had to enforce a regime of absolute stillness, often holding her hand over the mouths of the terrified as the iron-shod hooves of slave patrols clattered on the nearby macadamized roads. The sparks from their horses' shoes inches away from the ditch where the group lay pressed into the frozen earth. This was the true cost of freedom and meditation on the crushing weight of silence, where the survival of the many rested on the ability of the individual to suppress their own biological panic, turning the desire for liberty into a steel-cold discipline that overrode the body's most basic impulses for comfort and safety. With their supplies dwindled to handfuls of moldy bread and parched corn, Sarah became the accountant of their remaining life force, rationing calories with a surgical coldness that broke her heart but saved their lives. Sarah had to manage the psychological decay of the group, soothing the elderly whose joints had seized in the frost and calming the mothers whose infants were beginning to fade from the lack of nourishment. There were moments when the group's resolve wavered, when the promise of the North felt like a cruel mirage and the warmth of the quarters, however shackled, felt like a tempting lie. Sarah met these moments not with soft words, but with the hard truth of the star, reminding them that they had already burned the world behind them, and that the only path remaining was the one that led through the valley of the shadow of death. She made the choice to leave behind their few remaining heavy blankets to increase their speed, trading physical warmth for the tactical advantage of momentum, which proved her resolve was the strongest force in the group, a spiritual anchor that kept the entire unit from drifting into the abyss of despair as they approached the borderlands. The terrain became a geography of the noose and the chain, where the legal codes of the North and South collided in a violent, unpredictable friction. This was the territory of the blackbirders, bounty hunters who prowled the Mason-Dixon line with the legal authority of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, looking for the human property that would pay for their next bottle of whiskey. Sarah had to navigate this minefield of human greed, using her cartography of the quarter's skills to read the signs of the road, the specific way a gate was left open, the color of a ribbon tied to a mailbox, or the subtle arrangement of stones at a crossroads that signaled a conductor's presence. She learned to distinguish between the false friends who sought to lure them into traps for a reward and the true lights of the Quakers and abolitionists who risked their own lives to provide a cellar or a barn for a few hours of uneasy rest. This section explores the intense psychological warfare of the border, where the proximity to freedom actually increased the danger, as the hunters concentrated their efforts on the final bottlenecks of the escape routes. Sarah's mind became a living encyclopedia of aliases and codes. Every step was a gamble with the gallows, yet Sarah's resolve never flickered. She viewed the noose not as a threat, but as the final price of a ticket she had already decided to buy with her life. For Sarah, the act of continuing to walk when her feet were bleeding and her lungs were burning was the most profound indictment of the master's world. Her revenge was not just the fire she had left behind at the ginning house. It was the fact that she was still breathing, still choosing, and still moving toward a horizon he could never control. This section analyzes the spirit of the fugitive as a transformative power that turns the victim into a victor through the sheer force of will. Sarah realized that the master's power relied on the belief that the enslaved were content or incapable of self-governance. By surviving the impossible conditions of the North Star journey, she was physically disproving every sermon, every law, and every ledger entry that had ever tried to diminish her. The desire for liberty was not a passive dream. It was an active, aggressive force that propelled her through the frost-covered fields of Pennsylvania. She began to see herself not as a runaway, but as a reclaimer, someone who was taking back the years, the dignity, and the future that had been stolen from her. This refusal to turn back was a sovereign act of the human spirit, a declaration that once a soul has glimpsed the North Star, it can never again be satisfied with the shadows of the cave. Back on the plantation, the silence that followed the great exodus was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, necrotic quiet that signaled the onset of a total systemic failure. The master, a man who had built his identity on the pillars of order and ownership, walked through his empty halls and found that the foundation of his world had been replaced by a financial ghost of Sarah's making. For years, the master had looked at his ledgers and seen a healthy estate, never realizing that Sarah, the woman who had dusted his office and organized his papers, had been engaged in a long game of forensic sabotage. The ledgers she had altered before leaving were not merely messy. They were calculated landmines of misinformation. She had systematically misrecorded the yields of the cotton crops, lost the receipts for major equipment purchases, and fabricated debts to creditors who didn't exist, creating a tangled web of insolvency that no auditor could unravel. As the banks in Savannah began to call in their loans, the master realized with a cold, hollow terror that his white gold was not just ash in the barns, but a vacuum in the books. This section of the ruin explores the irony of a man who believed himself a master of men, yet was defeated by the very ink and paper he used to claim them. Sarah had turned the tools of his commerce into a noose of bankruptcy, proving that the intellectual labor he'd stolen was the only thing keeping the ledger from screaming the truth of his failure. He was left staring at pages of red ink that represented the lifeblood he had drained from his people, only to find that in the end, the blood had stained him beyond all hope of recovery. The letters Sarah had misplaced over the years were not actually lost. She had strategically tucked them into the correspondence of his rivals, his creditors, and the very legal authorities he sought to impress. As these letters came to light in the weeks following the escape, they exposed archive of his corruption. From his secret gambles with estate funds to his private letters mocking the very peers he toasted with bourbon, Sarah had curated a dossier of his hypocrisy, ensuring that when the silent storm finally broke, he would be left without a single ally in the county. This paragraph delves into the psychological horror of the master as he walked into the social clubs of Savannah, only to find the doors closed and the conversations silenced. The very woman he deemed subhuman had understood the social topography of his world better than he ever did, using his own pride as the whetstone for her blade. He found himself a pariah among the planters, not because he was cruel, they were all cruel, but because he had been exposed as incompetent and unreliable. Sarah's revenge was a social execution. She had stripped him of the only thing that gave him a sense of belonging, leaving him to rot in the vacuum of his own ego. while the world he had built upon a lie crumbled under the weight of the truth she had left behind. Without the labor of the women he exploited and the intelligence of the invisible network, Sarah commanded, the physical plantation descended into a state of industrial paralysis. The machinery of the estate, the gins Sarah had jammed, the wagons she had sabotaged, and the tools she had hidden, remained silent, mocking the master with their uselessness. He discovered that he didn't know how to run his own kingdom. He didn't know the timing of the planting, the chemistry of the soil, or the maintenance of the buildings, because he had outsourced the thinking of the plantation to the very people he claimed had no minds. This section explores the great stagnation, where the weeds began to reclaim the cotton rows, and the big house began to sag under the weight of its own neglect. The master stood on his porch and looked out over a landscape that was returning to the wilderness Sarah had mastered in the swamp. He was a king of a graveyard, ruling over empty cabins and broken plows, realizing that his wealth was never a natural resource, but a constant, violent theft of human ingenuity. The tragedy of his position was the realization that he was a parasite who had killed his host, and without the life force of the people he had oppressed, he was a hollow shell of a man. The property was gone, and with it, the very definition of his existence had evaporated, leaving him to preside over a kingdom of rust and rot that served as a physical monument to his own obsolescence. It wasn't an external army that had brought him to his knees. It wasn't a decree from Washington or a raid by John Brown. His downfall was the direct, calculated result of the woman who had served him his tea and cleaned his boots for 20 years. This realization was the most painful part of the ruin, the shattering of his worldview that required the enslaved to be content and inferior. He began to see Sarah's face in every corner of the house. He felt her presence in the mistakes that continued to plague his life, and in the whispers of the few remaining workers who looked at him with a new, terrifying pity. This segment explores the madness of the master as he spent his nights drinking and rereading the ledgers, trying to find the exact moment when the property had become the architect. He realized that Sarah had never been a slave. She had been an infiltrator, a sovereign mind that had merely worn the mask of submissiveness until the moment of the strike. The master was forced to spend the rest of his life acknowledging the intellectual and moral superiority of the woman he had tried to crush. He was haunted by the fact that she was somewhere in the north, walking as a queen in the light of day, while he was a prisoner of the ruin she had left behind, the king of a graveyard, whose only remaining subject was his own haunting regret. When Sarah finally crossed the invisible threshold into Philadelphia, the air did not simply turn cold. It turned electric, with the scent of coal smoke, industrial progress, and the dizzying, terrifying weight of self-ownership. She did not arrive as a broken victim seeking charity, but as a high-level intelligence officer defecting from a hostile regime, carrying a mental archive of the South's industrial and psychological vulnerabilities that she was ready to deploy as a weapon of mass liberation. Her revenge underwent its final alchemy in the brick-lined streets of the North, transforming from a private, smoldering fire into a public, radiant light as she integrated herself into the nerve center of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. Sarah realized almost immediately that her personal freedom was not a destination or a resting place, but a fortified platform. she began to conduct the resistance from the outside, using her deep, lived knowledge of plantation logistics, guard rotations, and river crossings to refine the routes of the Underground Railroad with a precision the North had never seen. She advised the great leaders of the movement, men like William Still and the fiery Frederick Douglass, not as a bystander or a mere witness to suffering, but as an expert on the geography of the invisible, providing the tactical data necessary to bypass the increasingly aggressive patrols emboldened by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This opening movement of her northern life, we see Sarah building a living bridge between the trauma of the Georgia marshes and the strategic hope of the Philadelphia committees. Applying the same discipline she used in the cartography of the quarters to the urban landscape of the free states, she understood that the master's world relied on the complicit silence of the North as much as the lash of the South, and she dedicated every waking hour to shattering that silence, turning her personal history into a blueprint for a national awakening that refused to look away from the reality of the noose and the chain. The second movement of Sarah's northern life focused on the power of the word, both written and spoken, as she transitioned from the ciphers in the quilt to the platforms of the abolitionist lecture circuit, where her voice became a resonant instrument of restorative justice. This segment explores the profound impact of her sovereign testimony, where Sarah challenged the intellectual foundations of white supremacy by simply standing before an audience and speaking with the analytical clarity of a survivor scholar who had deconstructed the machine of her own oppression. She didn't just tell stories of physical pain to elicit pity. She provided a structural analysis of how the plantation system functioned as a parasite on human ingenuity, exposing the frailty of the men who claimed to be masters. She spoke to crowded halls in Boston, New York, and London. Her presence, a direct refutation of the subhuman narrative that the South used to justify its economy. Every time she articulated the complexities of the alchemy of the kitchen or the geometry of the swamp, she was physically dismantling the legal and moral justifications for human bondage. Sarah became a mentor to a younger generation of activists, teaching them that the light of justice was not a passive, flickering glow, but a controlled, directed fire that had to be tended with the same grit they used to carry children through the Great Dismal. This section of her narrative is a meditation on the power of the black female voice as a catalyst for legislative change, showing how her internal resistance in the quarters paved the way for her political leadership in the free states, turning her unfinished symphony into a roar that the South could no longer ignore, even behind its walls of cotton and iron. While Sarah moved in the halls of political power, she never abandoned the domestic arts that had served as her first weapons, turning her quilting and cooking into a curriculum of intergenerational empowerment that redefined the role of black women in the North. She established sewing circles in Philadelphia that were far more than social gatherings. They were training grounds for a new generation of conductresses and community leaders who learned to weave political strategy into the fabric of their lives. Sarah taught these women the language of the needle, but she also taught them the language of radical self-worth, ensuring that the skills honed in the shadows of the plantation were now used to build the indestructible foundations of a free society. This section explores the stitched legacy of Sarah's work, where the quilts she produced were no longer secret maps for physical escape, but banners of historical record and symbols of a culture that refused to be erased. She worked tirelessly to locate the families she had left behind, using the grapevine telegraph to reunite mothers with children and sisters with brothers, treating every successful reunion as a victory over the auctioneer's gavel that had once tried to silence her. Sarah's life in the North was a testament to the fact that Black women's agency is not just a survival tactic, but a nation-building force that survives through the transmission of knowledge and the preservation of dignity. She used the proceeds from her lectures and her textile work to fund secret schools for the formerly enslaved, ensuring that the literacy she had once been forced to steal would be the birthright of every child who crossed the Mason-Dixon line, turning the unfinished symphony into a chorus of thousands of voices. The most personal and painful movement of Sarah's symphony, the lifelong search for her daughter, Maya, which served as the fuel that kept her fire burning long after her own chains were broken. Sarah utilized every resource of the Northern Abolitionist Network, the newspapers, the church bulletins, and the secret contacts in the Deep South to track the movement of the property that was her flesh and blood. This segment explores the psychological landscape of the searching mother, a harrowing reality for thousands of families shattered by the domestic slave trade. Yet, Sarah approached this heartbreak with the same strategic coldness she used to burn the master's gin. She mapped the slave markets of New Orleans and the plantations of the frontier with the same precision she used to map her own escape, refusing to let the distance or the years dim the resolve that had been forged in the Georgia red clay. This part of the narrative is an exploration of the indestructible bond of the Black matriarchy, showing how Sarah's revenge against the master was only truly complete when she could finally stand as a shield between her, daughter, and the world that had tried to consume her. The unfinished symphony of her life found its crescendo in the rumors and leads that she followed with the tenacity of a hunter, proving that the desire for family is as strong a force as the desire for liberty, and that the light of justice is most brilliant when it finally illuminates the face of a child, returned to her mother's arms after a lifetime of shadows.